After the American Football Conference championship game on January 18th, 2015, the National Football League hired a law firm to investigate the inflation of footballs during the first half of the game. And that law firm hired a research firm, an engineering firm, to perform engineering studies as to the nature of football inflation and deflation. This presentation is an interpretation of the data that was presented and integrates additional information to come to some conclusions. This slide presents the halftime pressure measurements taken within some locker room by two officials. All but one of the Patriots footballs was measured, the pressure was measured, and four of the Colts balls were measured. Before the end of the first half, the Colts intercepted a ball. The ball was taken to the Colts sideline, and members of the Colts staff measured the pressure of the ball and considered it abnormal and reported their findings, and that precipitated this rather wholesale measurement of football pressures. There was insufficient time to measure all of the Colts footballs. Unfortunately, the balls were not sequestered and allowed to reach equilibrium at a known temperature. And so this is actually the evidence that exists as to what the pressures were, for whatever reason, for the footballs during the first half. The average football pressures are given at the bottom of the Patriots and the Colts numbers. There are two gauges presented. One is the non-logo gauge, and the other is the logo gauge. The logo gauge, in general, is 0.4 psi higher than the non-logo gauge, plus or minus 0.05. And the non-logo gauge is incorrect. The non-logo gauge, according to a master calibration, is the correct gauge, is the correct pressure. The logo is actually a Wilson, the manufacturer of the ball, logo, and the non-logo gauge just simply doesn't have a logo. So there's no technical significance to logo or non-logo. The other thing to note in this list is the actual sequence of listing is according to which balls were measured when. So number one is the first ball measured. For both lists, the ball with the least pressure is toward the end of the list. So for the Colts, the number 10 is 10.5 in the non-logo gauge, and for the same gauge, ball number 4, 12.15 is the lowest of the Colt balls. I should note that there is some confusion with regard to the raw data that occurred during halftime. Apparently the gauges were swapped between the Patriots and the Colts, and ball number 3, apparently the data was swapped independent of that swap. So I've taken one of the tables of 3 that appears to be the most likely valid numbers for the measurements. Commenting on the logo and non-logo gauges in more detail, as I said, 2 gauges. We've given them names, logo and non-logo, but they're sort of just names. That they could be the blue gauge, they could be the white gauge. And the logo gauge incorrectly measured 0.4 plus or minus 0.05 higher than the non-logo gauge. Walt Anderson, who was the head referee and did the pregame measurement of the ball pressures, recalled that he used the logo gauge for pregame measurements. If the logo gauge was used for pregame measurement of the Patriot footballs, their nominal pressures would have been 12.1 psi, not 12.5. If the logo gauge had been used pregame on the Colt footballs, the nominal pressures would have been 12.6 psi, not 13.0. I emphasize nominal because one of the things that I'm going to look at in the course of this presentation is the fact that in general, if you inflate a ball up to a expected pressure value, the pressure will actually decline by several tenths of psi subsequently as the ball reaches equilibrium. So I think there should be significant error bars. If the referee adds air to the ball, and if the referee is not spending half an hour to establish an equilibrium with the ball, there should probably be error bars around the value that he thought he set the ball to. And I'll go into more detail later. The most interesting possibility is the logo gauge was used on the Patriot footballs and the non-logo gauge was used on the Colt footballs. That creates the widest spread in pressures between the Patriot and Colt footballs. Nominally, the Patriot footballs would be at 12.1 psi, and the Colt footballs would be 13.0. I should point out that that apparently some of the Patriot footballs were topped off in terms of adding pressure. So my comments about the fact that if you were to set the pressure at 12.5, it would likely drop back to 12.2 is applicable in this case. So I want to consider the Patriots balls in finer granularity. It turned out at halftime there were 4 dry Patriot footballs and 7 wet Patriot footballs. And the common sense that develops by looking at this problem would indicate that the 4 highest pressure balls were the dry balls, and the 7 lowest pressure balls were the wet balls, and that common sense will develop as we talk further. The average of the dry balls was 11.525 psi. That's down at the bottom. The average of the 7 wet balls was 10.871. I'd like to emphasize that if the only balls that were measured at halftime were the dry balls, no investigation would have been initiated. It's entirely the wet balls that have created the misunderstanding or that are problematic. I should also emphasize that apparently in the first half, the Patriots had much more playing time offensively than the Colts. And so the Patriots had a disproportionate number of wet balls. This slide just takes a slightly different perspective on the previous slide, and it presents the dry and wet PSI numbers as deltas from their respective average. And the min and max are also identified. So for the dry ball, the min is 0.375 less than the average of the dry balls. And the max for the dry balls is 0.25 psi above the average. So it's reasonably well balanced. For the wet balls, similarly, the min is 0.371 psi below the average, and the max is 0.229 above the average. The engineering analysis recognizes that wet balls can have lower pressures. So this is a chart that they took 1 or 2 footballs and tracked their pressures as they cycle through the expected temperature differences that occurred before the game, during the half, and at halftime. So the yellow line and the light blue line depict the red balls, and the red line and the dark blue line depict the dry balls. The report does not conjecture or analyze what it is about a wet ball that makes it have a lower pressure. And this seems to be very significant, because in order for you to understand the full extent of what a wet ball can do to the pressure, you have to have a mental model of what's going on. And that's lacking in the report. And the next slide is going to try to address that vacuum. So why might a wet football have a lower pressure? On the internet, speculation after the game was that a wet football stretched and the volume changed. The report excludes this possibility. In a different context, I'll consider that judgment potentially premature. Certainly, a wet ball is heavier, it has increased thermal mass, and that can delay temperature changes. And in fact, in the chart on the previous slide, that seems to be a significant effect. The effect that is depicted seems to be significantly that. But I think there's a number of other things that may in fact be more significant. At no point in the report, at least none that I recognized, is it mentioned that rainwater is colder than atmospheric temperature. And I think the best case of that, sort of the extreme case is hail, in which it doesn't have to be freezing for hail to occur. Certainly, cold rainwater will lower the temperature of the atmosphere, but it is a mistake to infer the temperature of the rainwater from the ambient dry temperature of the air. Unfortunately, there is no record of the temperature of the rainwater. Independent of that background circumstance, evaporative cooling can have a huge effect. Evaporative cooling depends on airflow across a west surface. People die because of evaporative cooling. It's really quite dangerous. And airflow was not considered in the analysis of temperature variation. The delta of 0.654 psi between wet and dry football averages, average pressures, corresponds approximately to 13 degrees Fahrenheit difference. There were no direct temperature measurements of the footballs. The only inference about football temperatures is being made by atmospheric temperatures. In the follow-up video to this presentation, I demonstrate a 10 degree Fahrenheit drop in temperature for a deflated wet football due to evaporative cooling. So it's a real and significant effect. The task taken on by the engineering firm was very challenging. And this slide attempts to list a number of those challenges. We don't know which gauges were actually used before the game. We don't know how accurate the pre-game gauging was. I've mentioned that in the scenarios that I've done, it's possible to see 0.3 psi drop after you do the initial gauging of a ball. It is only by a massive amount of indirect inference that the temperature of each ball at the time of measurement can be inferred. The balls are brought inside from 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 72 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit, it's believed. And this is the transition that was simulated by the engineering team. I note that, though, that when you get a number of people coming into a room with a bunch of equipment that's reached equilibrium at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, that actually reduces the room of the temperature of an interior room. And so it's only essentially the inference that the thermostat, I assume that the thermostat was usually set to 72 to 73 degrees, that it's on that basis that this transition is modeled. 7 of 11 Patriot footballs were wet. And I've tried to point out that there's no direct evidence of the temperature of the water. There's no direct evidence of the effect of evaporative cooling. And I've done my best in the earlier slides to identify, it's those wet balls that are in fact the problematic um, uh, concern. There's no record of airflow in any of the day's circumstances. So as far as I can tell in the report, there's no essentially the analysis was not done with airflow as a potential issue. I'm sure that further investigation could be done and some information could be gleaned, but I also assumed that it would be not complete and there would still be gaps, and we still don't know how cold the water was, the rainwater. There's no record of whether the footballs were clumped together. The raw engineering data was collected from individual footballs and how they cycled according to temperature and pressure through these transitions of being outside, being brought in, starting inside, going outside, and coming back in. If the footballs are clumped together so that they become an integrated thermal mass, that will delay thermal changes. And in fact, in the simulations, we'll see the conclusions drawn by the analysis rely heavily on the assumption that a difference of a couple of minutes is significant to the thermal profiling. And as I'll describe in the coming slides, the distinction in those minutes amounts to a distinction in 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Fahrenheit for the footballs. The pressure of the individual footballs was measured across a span of approximately 15 minutes. And where exactly in that 15 minutes individual balls were measured is can only be surmised at the coarsest level, so that when the simulations were done, essentially multiple windows and multiple possibilities are described, because no one knows actually when the balls were measured. They just know there are videos of people going into specific rooms and coming out of specific rooms, but when individual balls were measured, well, that information is not specifically known. We don't know what we don't know. There might be other things that affected the pressures. And so any analysis has to have the footnote that until we get more information. And finally, the analysis, the whole point of the analysis is to allow that somebody might have tampered with the footballs, and then specifically between the pregame measurements and arriving out on the football field. And for the investigative report, this is the only question of interest, and the other questions are only being asked in order to eliminate them. The engineering analysis includes game day simulations, and this is a case of completely recreating the multi-hour sequence of environmental changes and football preparation, gauging, pressures, everything. It is an outstanding attempt to derive solid information out of very imprecise information. One of the 2 game day simulations used the logo gauge initially, so the Patriots footballs would have been nominally at 12.1 psi, and then used a master gauge, a gauge that is believed to be accurate. And they also did the same thing with a non-logo gauge and then used the master gauge also. The odd thing is that for the non-logo and logo gauge simulations, the pre-game temperatures are different. The logo gauge simulation used an initial 67 degrees Fahrenheit pre-game, and the non-logo gauge used a 71 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. And since 1 degrees Fahrenheit has an impact of 0.05 psi, the consequence of this is that you can extrapolate the 71 degrees Fahrenheit pre-game temperature by subtracting 0.2 psi. And that's what the next slide is going to present. The simulation has three variants. One is that the Patriots measurements start at 1 minute 30 seconds after going into the rim, I assume. Another one starts at 3 minutes 20 seconds after going into the rim, and another one starts at 5 minutes after entering the rim. And so the next slide will present the extrapolated data. It's in the same format. So I've gone through, and for the Patriot average pressure and the Colts average pressure, the 0.2 has been subtracted from all the numbers. The difference in the Patriot numbers by time is roughly 0.1 psi, and that corresponds to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So the basic model here is that for every approximately just under 2 minutes of time, the temperature is going up 2 degrees Fahrenheit from the equilibrium at 48 degrees Fahrenheit to the room temperature of 72 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, going back to the original plot of dry and cold balls, it's recognized that the wet balls and the dry balls change pressure at different rates. So from that data, in the previous slide, I offered this analysis. If measurements start at 1 minute 30 seconds, there's a good fit at 11.15 psi in the simulation and 11.11 psi measured by the non-logo gauge at halftime. The non-logo gauge gets the same readings as the master gauge, and the non-logo gauge is used at pregame, and so that just sets the initial conditions, and that would have set the Patriots footballs at nominally 12.1 psi. Game day timeline reconstruction indicates that would start the measurements too soon. So the conclusion of the report is that's unlikely. They would expect the measurements to start at 3:20 or 5 minutes after entering the room. For measurements at 3:20 or later, non-simulated effects are required. So a simulation was done. It doesn't mean that they got everything right. And so these are some of the things that could be wrong, sources of error that are not quantified in the report. Evaporative cooling due to airflow, rainwater colder than atmospheric temperature, any football sitting in a puddle of standing water. The fact that the coldest footballs are typically the balls that come out last suggests to me that those balls may have been sitting in puddles of water that essentially created both more thermal cold mass and a source of evaporative cooling. I assume that the footballs came into the room in bags and that the footballs stayed in the bags until they were reached for to be measured. Well, if by that means or any other means the footballs were clumped together, so if thermal mass that's reached equilibrium outside is clumped together after it's brought inside, then it's not going to reach thermal equilibrium as fast, and it's going to slow down the rising temperatures of the footballs. I've mentioned that it's quite possible that for some of the footballs there was inaccurate pregame gauging. I've considered that the volume within the rubber bladder, or there might be air leakage from the football. These possibilities are excluded by the report, but I'll present some more information later on about that possibility. And then finally, of course, and this is what the investigation is all about, is the footballs might have been tampered with. And so in this case, what we have is somehow it was recognized which footballs were going to get wet. And those footballs, for those footballs, the pressure was lowered by some amount that presumably was believed to be beneficial. So the expected pressure difference between a minute 30 seconds and 3 minutes 20 seconds, or 3 minutes 20 seconds and 5 minutes, each correspond respectively to about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is based on 0.05 psi per 1 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't think that there's any physical basis to assert that football tampering is the most likely source of a discrepancy of 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit per ball in this process. I restrict my comments to the physical analysis, the thermal effects, the pressure effects. But of that list earlier up on the slide, I don't see how you can conclude that football tampering is more likely than the others. I'd like to talk about, there was about half a page of analysis as to whether the pressure of the football could change due to activity. And this is a picture that was taken from the report. So the piston exerts 650 pounds of force. It is exerted once a second 4,000 times. And the report concludes that there was no change in pressure. My observation is the piston is sitting directly on top of the air valve. And so the piston would have prevented air loss if air loss in other circumstances would have occurred. And I have an experiment in a video associated with this presentation in which I essentially apply my own weight to a football for a similar period of time, and it appears that there's a drop of about 0.4 psi. I can't say whether it's an air loss or a volume increase, and that alludes to the next slide. But I think that the short analysis that was done on this aspect may not be the last word. With respect to volume, the engineering analysis analyzed the external volume using a laser scanner and concluded that the volume doesn't change. I think that if you think about it, it's sort of obvious that the volume that matters is the interior volume of the bladder. And the interior surface of a football, the surface that goes against the bladder, isn't smooth. There are seams, and at the two ends of the football, the interior surface is highly irregular. And the bladder has to be forced into those areas, and the seams have to be pushed down by the bladder. So there's an opportunity for there to be a change in the interior volume. And I attempt to demonstrate that, but as I say, I can't tell whether it's a change in interior volume or the release of air. It could be either. So I made a video, but it's long, so it'll probably be a separate video from the video that contains these slides. In that video, talking very generally, I release a bit of air from a new football, and this is based on the model that occurs with the Patriot footballs when they begin preparation of footballs. They actually get a special order of football for special games, and they have the game logos and things like that. The football usually arrives, in my experience, at about 9 pounds per square inch. When they're manufactured, they're put in a mold and inflated to 120 psi, and they hold that pressure for a minute, and then they drop the pressure to 13 psi, and then release the mold. My guess is that the temperature is very high, and by the time that football reaches thermal equilibrium, it's at about 9 psi. So when I released the football, I released it down to about 6 psi. I don't know what the practice of the Patriots is. I then pumped the football up over 12.5 and then brought it back down to 12.5. The pump has a very imprecise gauge on it, and so you put the separate gauge in the football, and it's got a button on the top that allows you to release fine amounts of pressure. I then waited about 40 minutes for the pressure to stabilize, and at the end of 40 minutes, it had gone down 0.3 psi from 0.65 psi initially. I exercised the football by putting it between 2x12s and standing on the upper 2x12 and rolling it around. Afterward, I regauged it, and the football had lost pressure. Initially, the football, because it was warm, had increased in pressure, but eventually it decreased, and it looks like the the consequence of exercising the ball caused the pressure to drop about 0.4 psi, and I don't know whether that was by release of air or increase of internal volume. I do a demonstration of evaporative cooling and demonstrate a 10-degree Fahrenheit drop in temperature for a football. Now, it turned out the video was long, even though all of the waiting around was not filmed. And this presentation is also going to be long. So a bunch of people may in fact not see it. So I'm going to nail down a little bit more data on what that video contained. I initially had a control ball at 12.45 psi and a test ball at 8.45 psi. That was the new ball. I deflated the test ball to 6.0 or 6.05 psi. I manipulated the ball and pushing in the ends and squeezing the ball. And the pressure increased to 6.15 psi. I waited some time to make sure it was stable, and it was stable. I inflated the test ball to 12.65 psi. Over the next 40 minutes, it stabilized at 12.35 psi, and there was a loss of 0.3 psi, and that's why I refer to the pregame gauging and adding air to some of the balls as, well, you know, you may think that you set the ball at 12.5, but if you go back half an hour later, you're very likely to see it significantly down on pressure. So I exercised that ball. It was at 12.35 now, and immediately after exercising it was up to 12.9 psi. It gradually decreased in pressure until it stabilized at 12.1 psi. Concurrently, the control ball increased from 12.35 to 12.55 psi. So there was net loss of pressure due to the activity of approximately 0.45 psi. And that's 20 psi measured, and also 20 psi from the relative to the control ball. Actually, that should read 0.40 psi. Finally, I demonstrated a 10-degree Fahrenheit drop in ball temperature due to evaporative cooling. I had a ball that I had damaged the valve, could not be inflated anymore. So I soaked it in water for 4 hours and put it in front of a fan. And it was in the water for 4 hours, so it was in thermal equilibrium with the outside. The water was basically the ambient atmospheric temperature. And I watched with a thermocouple the temperature of the football go down 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's one of the reasons why the video is so long. But so evaporative cooling is a real effect and can have consequences. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I hope you know more about ball inflation, air pressure, and the thermal effects of air pressure, the thermal effects on air pressure. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.